Snow fell like torn feathers from a sky the color of iron, settling against rooftops and hitching posts, softening the hard lines of the town yet making every sound sharper. Boots thudded against frozen planks, wagons groaned in protest, and through the narrow street a thin figure walked, shawl clutched tight around her shoulders, eyes cast downward. Eliza May Carter was only 18, but the air around her already carried the heaviness of someone twice that age. The gossip followed her, quick and cruel, like sparrows darting overhead. Still untouched, still a virgin, and being led like livestock into a life none of them would dare endure. Her Uncle Thomas walked beside her, his coat buttoned high, collar turned against the cold. He would not look at her. His jaw worked as though chewing something sour. Shame etched lines deeper into his face than the years had. Once he had been her guardian, his hand heavy on her shoulder, his voice demanding obedience. Now his hand merely clutched the worn brim of his hat, and his silence weighed more than words ever had. Each step toward the gathering at the edge of town carved another scar between them, though neither spoke of it. Ahead, where the snow thickened and wind tangled in the bare branches, a figure waited. He seemed part of the storm itself, immovable, immense, with hair as white as the drifts piling against the fence posts. Gray Hawk. That was the name the settlers used, spoken with equal parts awe and fear. An Apache warrior turned widower, older than most men dared to keep breathing in such a hard land. His presence was a shadow over every conversation. Muscular still, even at 56, his arms bore the scars of battles most had only heard of. He stood silent now, furs draped across his shoulders, hands bare despite the biting cold, as if winter itself would not dare touch him. Eliza did not lift her eyes to meet his. She could not. Her lashes clung with half-melted snowflakes, her breath fogging before her lips. The weight of stares from townsfolk pressed into her back. Women clutched shawls tighter around their throats, whispering about what would happen to her body. Men smirked into their beards, muttering that the savage had won himself a lamb. No one reached for her hand, no one offered comfort. She was a figure of transaction, not of kin or care. Sheriff Amos Whitlock stood nearby, his badge glinting under the faint sun that struggled through clouds. His eyes, cold as the barrel of his revolver, flicked between Thomas and Gray Hawk. "It's your word," he said low, voice carrying across the hush. "Once done, it's done." The sheriff had no fondness for Gray Hawk, nor for the Carter kin, but law was law, and even shameful bargains counted as binding when witnessed. Thomas cleared his throat. His lips trembled before the words found strength. "For her keep," he muttered. "For her safety. Better with him than starvin' under my roof." His words carried upward, breaking like brittle sticks, but they echoed all the same. He pulled a folded scrap of paper from his coat, signed with a hand that shook too much, and thrust it into the sheriff's palm. It was not law that made it binding. It was hunger. It was desperation. And it was done. Eliza felt her chest tighten as though bound by rope. Her heart pounded against bone, wild and fearful. She wanted to scream, to beg, to ask why God had given her to kin who traded her like grain. Yet her throat closed, and no sound came. Only silence. She thought of her mother, buried 2 winters before, of the hymns sung softly at night, of promises whispered that she would be cherished, not discarded. Those promises had melted like frost in sunlight. All that remained was this path, this giving away, this man whose shadow covered her life now. Gray Hawk did not speak. His black eyes met Thomas's for a heartbeat, then dropped to Eliza. He reached into his fur cloak, withdrew a heavy mantle lined with wolf hide, and held it out. The gesture was not gentle, nor harsh. It was simple. He offered her warmth. Her fingers trembled as she accepted it, drawing the thick weight around her shoulders. Heat seeped into her bones, so foreign it almost hurt. For a moment she met his gaze. In that moment she saw not hunger, not lust, but something quieter. Emptiness, grief coiled deep, as if he carried ghosts heavier than any living wife could ever be. Then he looked away, turning his profile to the wind, jaw cut against the storm. Hattie Lou, the gossiping widow, clucked her tongue behind gloved fingers. "Poor lamb," she hissed to another. "Gone to a grave, mark my words." The other woman nodded, lips pursed tight. Their voices carried, and Eliza's face burned crimson. The shame pressed against her like frostbite. She pulled the wolf hide closer, not for warmth but to hide her body, her youth, the very things the world now counted against her. Sheriff Amos tucked the paper into his coat, his eyes narrowing. "That's it then," he said, his voice final as a gavel. "She's his now." The words split the air, undeniable. Know him, no prayer could erase them. Thomas still did not meet her eyes. He stepped back, his boots creaking in packed snow, his shoulders slumping like a man half his age. For him, the matter was closed. For her, it had only begun. Grey Hawk moved at last, a great bear of a man stepping through the snow with quiet strength. He placed a hand, broad and calloused, lightly against her back. Not pushing, not dragging, simply guiding. She flinched at first, but his touch remained steady, neither forceful nor tender. It was a touch that said, "The world is watching, but we will walk anyway." Eliza obeyed, her feet unsteady in the drift, the murmur of townsfolk dimming as distance grew. Each step carried her further from the only life she had known, further into the unknown shadow of this man, whose silence frightened her more than rage would have. The cabin lay beyond town, its roof just visible through veils of snow, smoke curling from the chimney like a thin black thread against the pale sky. With each step, the voices of gossip and judgment faded, replaced by the moan of the wind through skeletal trees. Her breath hitched. Her heart did not slow. She glanced sideways at Grey Hawk, his stride unbroken, his eyes fixed forward, his white hair streaming behind him like a banner of winter. He looked untouchable, untamed. She wondered what had made his hair pale, what sorrow had carved those furrows into his brow, what ghosts lingered in his silence. She wondered if she would ever be more than another shadow in his house. When they reached the door, the storm swelled, snow swirling madly as if the world itself hesitated. Grey Hawk pushed the door open. The warmth inside struck her face, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and stone. For a breath she stood frozen on the threshold, the last of the town's noise echoing faint in her ears. Then, with a soft nudge of his hand, she crossed into his world. The door shut behind them with a sound like the ending of a hymn. Darkness folded around her, broken only by the flicker of fire. Outside, the storm raged on, a veil drawn tight. Inside, silence stretched vast, heavy and unbroken. She clutched the cloak tighter, heart racing, waiting for words that did not come. And in that silence, the truth of her fate pressed down. She had been given away, but what awaited her was no clear cruelty, no easy mercy. Only mystery, and the endless, watchful quiet of a man whose grief was older than she could understand. The cabin breathed with the steady rhythm of fire, its stone hearth glowing orange and gold against rough-hewn timbers darkened by years of smoke. Eliza stood just inside the threshold, her boots leaving faint trails of melted snow across the plank floor. The air inside was warm, yet her body shook with a tremor that came not from winter's bite, but from fear that had settled in her bones. She pulled the wolf hide closer around her shoulders, the coarse fur scratching her cheek, and let her eyes adjust to the dim light. Grey Hawk moved through the room without sound, each step measured, each motion deliberate. He unfastened the heavy cloak from his shoulders and hung it on a peg, steam rising faintly from its damp edges. His hair, long and white, caught the glow of the fire like strands of pale flame. He did not look at her, nor speak. Instead, he crouched by the hearth, feeding a fresh log into the blaze. Sparks leapt upward, tiny stars that died against the chimney stone. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable, broken only by the hiss of wood and the distant moan of wind pressing against the walls. Eliza's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had been told to expect force, to prepare for a night of violence. Women in town had whispered it with pitiful eyes, their words sharp as knives. He will claim you, body and soul, before dawn. Yet here, in the dim light of the cabin, Grey Hawk made no move toward her. He turned instead toward a shelf, where a slab of venison rested beside a loaf of coarse bread. Without a word, he set both on the table, placing a tin cup of water beside them. Then he stepped back, folding his arms across his chest, as though the act of providing had completed all he meant to do. Her throat tightened. Hunger gnawed at her, but the thought of eating under his gaze felt unbearable. Still, her body betrayed her. She reached hesitantly for the bread, fingers trembling, and tore a piece small enough to hide between her lips. It was dry, tasteless, yet it steadied her enough to breathe. When she glanced at him, he had turned away, staring into the fire as though it alone required his attention. Relief pricked her chest, mixed with confusion. Why had he not taken what everyone swore he would? She let her eyes roam the cabin. It was sparse but not cruel. A narrow bed stood against one wall, blankets folded with soldier's precision. Near it, half hidden in shadows, stood a cradle carved from cedar, empty and dusted with time. Beside it lay a shawl, faded but carefully folded. The sight pierced her. Proof that this place had once held a woman, proof that she herself was not the first to step across this threshold. A widow's home, haunted by absence. The discovery unsettled her more than comforted. She turned quickly, sinking into a chair near the table, the fur cloak heavy around her shoulders. The fire's warmth began to seep into her bones, but her spirit remained raw, flayed by shame. Outside, the storm beat against the walls like fists. Inside, she felt the strange weight of being watched and not touched, offered food but not words. A prison of silence, more confounding than cruelty. Greyhawk lifted a clay pipe from the mantel, tamped it with herbs, and lit it from the fire. He inhaled deeply, his chest expanding like the bellows of a forge, then exhaled a stream of smoke that curled upward, mingling with the flicker of flames. His face, half-lit, half-shadowed, looked carved from stone, lined with age yet steady, as if he were made for this harsh land. When at last his gaze drifted toward her, it was brief, unmeasurable, and he turned away before she could decipher it. Hours passed slowly, time marked only by the crackle of wood and the low whistle of wind squeezing through chinks in the walls. When Greyhawk at last settled for rest, he did not approach the bed. Instead, he lay on a blanket near the hearth, his great body stretched out before the flames, head pillowed against his arm. The firelight danced across his weathered face, softening the edges of scars, making him appear less a warrior than a weary man who had walked too many miles. He closed his eyes, leaving her alone in the strangeness of the room. Eliza sat rigid in the chair, watching him. Her pulse drummed fast, her breath shallow. Yet as minutes turned to an hour, tension began to ease. The sound of his breathing, steady and even, filled the cabin with something almost like safety. He had given her the bed. He had claimed only the floor. Confusion swirled in her mind, mixing with faint threads of relief. Could the whispers in town have been wrong? Or was this simply the calm before an inevitable storm? She rose, careful not to let the boards creak, and approached the bed. The blankets smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, a clean, earthy scent. She hesitated, hands trembling at the thought of laying where another woman once had, but exhaustion conquered her shame. She lowered herself onto the mattress, drawing the covers tight, her body sinking into warmth she had not known since her mother's arms. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams laced with voices of gossip, with images of being dragged, of being broken. Yet each time fear jolted her awake. The sight of Greyhawk's unmoving figure by the fire anchored her back to the present. The storm roared all night, but the cabin held strong. At dawn, pale light slipped through the shutters, illuminating the rough interior with muted silver. Eliza stirred, rising cautiously. Greyhawk was already awake, crouched by the hearth, coaxing the fire with careful hands. He had cooked a small portion of venison on an iron pan, setting it aside for her. The smell filled the room, sharp and savory, stirring her hunger once more. She felt her cheeks flush as she accepted it, murmuring a faint, "Thank you," though she doubted he understood. His eyes flicked to her for the briefest moment, unreadable, then returned to the fire. Later, while tending to her shawl, she found its torn hem had been mended. The stitching was coarse but deliberate, the thread a little darker than the fabric. She traced it with her finger, realizing it had been done while she slept. Heat spread through her chest, confusing and disquieting. Why would a man expected to treat her as property bother with something so small? The act unsettled her more than violence might have. It left her wondering what he wanted, what he expected, and why his silence pressed harder than words ever could. That night, after another day of silence punctuated by gestures, a loaf placed on the table, water refilled, would carried in, she awoke to a sound that froze her breath. Low, muffled, almost swallowed by the crackle of fire, came the sound of weeping. At first she thought it her imagination, but when she sat up, she saw Grey Hawk sitting near the hearth, head bowed, shoulders trembling. His voice murmured in a tongue she did not know, rough and breaking, words carried on sorrow too heavy to hide. She clutched the blanket to her chest, heart aching at the sight. For the first time she glimpsed him not as the giant who had taken her, but as a man carved hollow by grief. She did not move, did not speak. She only watched, the fire painting him in gold and shadow. Tears stung her own eyes, though she did not know why. Perhaps because in his sorrow she recognized her own. When at last he stilled, wiping his face with the back of his hand, he glanced toward her bed as though sensing her wakefulness. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, and she froze, unable to look away. Then he turned back to the fire, saying nothing. Eliza lay back down, but sleep did not come. The sound of his grief lingered, weaving with her own loneliness. She realized then that the silence between them was not emptiness but weight, heavy with things neither dared to speak. And in that weight, something fragile had shifted, though she could not yet name it. The snow thinned as winter waned, though its ghost lingered in icy patches along the riverbanks and brittle frost on the fences. Spring sunlight slid across the land like pale gold, but warmth did not soften the weight pressing on Eliza's shoulders. Each step into town was a trial, her breath catching with every face that turned to watch her. Grey Hawk walked at her side, tall and unmoving, his silence as steady as the mountains, yet it could not shield her from the sharpness of eyes and tongues. The wooden boardwalk creaked under their boots as they passed the mercantile. A child no older than 6 peeked from behind her mother's skirt, pointing wide-eyed at the giant with the white hair. The mother pulled the girl back, whispering quickly, gaze fixed on Eliza as though pity and contempt might bruise her skin. A man spit tobacco into the dirt, muttering, "Sold off like a heifer." His voice carried, heavy with derision, and Eliza's cheeks burned hot. She kept her eyes lowered, clinging to the wolf-hide cloak, as though it alone could hide her shame. Sheriff Amos Whitlock stood near the post office, arms folded across his chest, badge glinting in the noon light. His gaze tracked them, cold and assessing. When they drew near, he stepped forward, boots thumping heavy on the boards. "Eliza May," he said, voice cutting through the street's murmurs. "You safe where you're livin'?" His tone left little room for her to answer without judgment. She swallowed, lips parting, but words tangled in her throat. Grey Hawk did not speak, only placed a silver coin on the counter of the supply store, his hand steady, his eyes fixed ahead. The sheriff's stare lingered a moment longer before he stepped back, yet his meaning was clear. Every glance, every word implied suspicion. The gossip that had followed Eliza since that snowstorm now thickened into smoke, curling around her wherever she went. Women whispered behind gloved hands, their faces arranged in pious sorrow. Hattie Lou, broad-hipped in her dark bonnet, leaned against a post and called softly to another. "She looks pale. Reckon he keeps her up nights." The other nodded, lips pursed tight, glancing deliberately at Eliza. Their judgment cut sharper than blades, for it was not only about her, but about what kind of woman she must be to endure such a marriage. Eliza's heart thundered, but when she risked a glance at Grey Hawk, he stood unshaken. His black eyes did not falter, his steps did not quicken. He bore their malice as one might bear weather, letting it break against him without acknowledgment. In his shadow, she felt both shielded and exposed, as though his strength could hold the world at bay, yet it could not erase the whispers that stained her name. That night, back in the cabin, she stitched by lamplight, her fingers raw from the needle. She worked not from command, but from some need to prove her worth, to repay his silence with service. Shame gnawed at her. She had no dowry, no skills save for simple mending, and no children to give him. She thought of the empty cradle, the folded shawl, the grief she had heard in his midnight weeping. Perhaps that was what the town could never see. His heart hollowed by loss, her life hollowed by abandonment. Two shells of people bound together, not by love, but by circumstance. Grey Hawk watched her from his place by the fire. His pipe smoke curled through the lamplight, and though he said nothing, she felt his eyes on her hands as she worked. At last he rose, lifting a bundle from beside the hearth. He carried it to her and laid it on the table. Inside was an old steel trap, rusted and in need of oil. He set it before her, then guided her hand to the hinge, showing her where it caught, where it could break skin if she was not careful. He did not use words, only gestures, his touch rough but precise. She followed, fumbling, her fear plain. Yet when the trap clicked shut under her control, he nodded once, as though her small triumph mattered. From that night on, lessons continued. He showed her how to set snares in the snow, how to read animal tracks, how to watch the sky for signs of weather. His patience startled her. He guided her hands without chastising, his silence carrying weight but never cruelty. And she, in turn, began to hum while she worked, scraps of hymns her mother had sung. At first she did it to soothe herself, but she noticed his eyes close sometimes, as though the melody reached some hidden chamber within him. Still, the town did not forgive. Each journey for supplies renewed the sting. Sheriff Amos's questions sharpened. "You sure he ain't keepin' you against your will?" The women's whispers grew crueler. "She'll end in the dirt like his last." Each word pressed against her, urging her to doubt, to flee, to crumble. But when she returned to the cabin, the storm of judgment thinned. There, in the glow of fire, she began to feel the faintest thread of belonging. The shame did not vanish, but it shifted, no longer her only truth. One evening, as dusk bled into violet shadows, Grey Hawk placed something unexpected before her. His war axe, heavy and worn, blade etched with scars. He set it on the table without a word, then turned and walked into the night air. The gesture was startling, almost frightening. She stared at the weapon, fingers trembling near the handle. Why would he leave such a thing with her? Was it trust? A test? Or some unspoken acknowledgement that she was not a prisoner here, that she could defend herself if she wished? Her breath caught, heart racing as she touched the cold steel. In its weight she felt not threat but recognition. The world outside still branded her a victim, a possession, a shame. Yet within these walls, a man marked as savage had handed her the very tool of his survival. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. It hinted at a bond neither of them had named, fragile as thawing ice, dangerous as fire, yet alive. She set the axe down carefully, eyes drawn to the open door where snow still lingered against the threshold. Grey Hawk's shadow moved in the twilight, tall and solitary, his white hair catching the last light of day. For the first time, she felt the stir of something unfamiliar, fear still, but mixed with a spark of dignity, as if the world's judgment had not yet broken her, and perhaps never would. Spring crept slow and reluctant, snow melting into mud along the trails, rivers swelling with thaw, the air carrying the faint scent of earth waking from long sleep. The cabin, once cloaked in silence and storm, now breathed differently. Windows cracked for fresh air, fire less urgent in the hearth, and light that lingered longer each evening. Yet Eliza still carried the weight of whispers that clung like burrs to her skirts. The world beyond their door had not softened. Only here, in the quiet orbit of Grey Hawk's presence, did she begin to feel the shape of something gentler. She found herself humming while she worked, not out of intent, but because silence no longer pressed as heavily. Her voice was thin at first, no more than a thread, but it wove through the air as she swept the floor or kneaded bread. One evening, as shadows grew long, she realized he was listening. Grey Hawk sat by the hearth, pipe unlit in his hand. His eyes closed as though her voice carried him to a place he had once known. She faltered mid-tune, cheeks burning, but he did not stir. He only breathed deeper, as though the sound itself kept him alive. The lessons he offered her changed with the season. No longer did he only guide her in snares and traps. Now he lifted her hand toward the night sky, naming stars in Apache tongue, syllables rough yet tender on his lips. She repeated them, stumbling, her laughter quiet but unguarded. In return, she taught him the hymns of her childhood, the words halting from his mouth but sung with strange reverence. Slowly, their silence grew layered, no longer empty, but filled with shared fragments of two worlds. Still, judgment did not rest. On their visits into town, she felt the weight of eyes and the hiss of voices coil around her. Hattie Lou whispered louder now, as if daring her to hear. "She defends him, imagine that. Savage's bride through and through." Sheriff Amos pressed harder, his questions barbed. "If you wish to leave, girl, say so now." His stare pinned her like a trapped bird, daring her to speak rebellion. And yet, when the moment came, she surprised even herself. She lifted her chin, her voice steady though her knees shook. "I am not mistreated. He has been kinder than any of you." The words shocked the crowd, silenced even Amos for a heartbeat. She saw disgust in some faces, disbelief in others, but in her own heart there stirred something unexpected: pride. Not in what she had been forced into, but in the choice she had found within it. Back at the cabin, Greyhawk tended a small cut on her hand, the blade of a knife having slipped while she chopped roots. She expected indifference, but instead he took her hand in his, rough fingers trembling as he pressed salve into the wound. His touch lingered, hesitant, as though afraid of breaking something fragile. She looked up, and for once his gaze did not turn away. In his dark eyes she saw grief, yes, but also a question, one she did not yet know how to answer. That night, the air between them felt changed. She brushed her fingers through his long white hair as he sat by the fire, pulling tangles free with a care she did not understand herself. He allowed it, head bowed, the warrior humbled by the gentleness of her hand. The fire crackled, the storm outside had quieted, and for a moment they seemed not a girl given away and a widowed giant, but two souls caught in the slow turning of seasons, thawing together. Yet spring carried not only renewal but danger. The gossip of town had turned into threats, carried to her by a trembling child who whispered that men spoke of taking her back, by law or by force. Thomas, her uncle, had stirred the pot, muttering that she was stolen, not given. Sheriff Amos listened, fueled by righteousness or pride, and the townsfolk sharpened their judgment into action. Fear pressed into her chest, but when she told Greyhawk, he only listened, his jaw tight, his silence heavier than ever. He did not promise safety, did not speak of what he would do, yet she knew the weight of his stillness meant more than any oath. As dusk fell one evening, she stood in the doorway, watching the river rush swollen with meltwater, the forest alive with bird call. Greyhawk came to her side, the wolf-hide cloak across his shoulders. He lifted his hand, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers calloused yet careful. The gesture startled her with its intimacy. She wanted to step back, but instead she closed her eyes, leaning into the touch. It was not claim, not command, it was acknowledgement. She opened her eyes to find him watching her, a question in his gaze again. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The air itself carried the answer, that whatever had begun as giving away had become something different, something chosen. But peace was fragile, easily shattered. Just as she reached for the courage to speak, to tell him that fear no longer ruled her, the knock came. Hard, insistent, rattling the cabin door until the hinges shuddered. The sound jolted through her like lightning, freezing her breath. Outside, voices rose, men's voices, stern and bristling, the sharp edge of rifles glinting in her imagination. The knock came again louder, followed by Sheriff Amos's voice, cold and unyielding. "Step out, Greyhawk. Bring the girl. This ends tonight." Her heart raced, hands clenching the shawl at her chest. Greyhawk rose, the movement slow and steady, his frame filling the cabin like a mountain rising. He reached for the door, pausing only to glance back at her. For a moment, silence pressed between them, thicker than any storm. His eyes met hers, dark and steady, as if asking without words if she was ready for what must come. She nodded, her breath shuddering, and the weight of her choice settled in her chest. The door creaked as he set his hand against it, the storm of judgment waiting just beyond the threshold. The fire cast his shadow long across the walls, the axe gleaming faintly where he had laid it. Eliza's pulse hammered as she realized this was no longer about shame, nor whispers, nor survival. It was about standing, together or apart, before a world that wanted them broken. The door began to open, letting in a slice of night and the glow of lanterns beyond. And in that narrow seam of light, everything they had built in silence balanced on the edge of unraveling. The night split open as the door swung wide, lantern light flooding the threshold, catching snowflakes that whirled in restless circles. Sheriff Amos stood at the front, his coat buttoned high, his badge glinting like a shard of ice. Behind him, A half-dozen men gripped rifles, their breath clouding in the cold, their eyes hard with judgment and fear. Eliza clutched the wolf hide close, her heart thundering as the storm of townsfolk pressed against the quiet of the cabin. Grey Hawk stepped out first, bare-chested beneath his cloak, his massive frame illuminated by the wavering glow of the lanterns. His hair, long and white, streamed like snow against the darkness, his scars written bold across his skin. He held no weapon in his hands, though the axe leaned by the wall inside. His silence was a force of its own, steady as stone, daring any man to measure himself against it. "Bring her out," Amos barked, voice sharp as the crack of a whip. "The town won't stand for this any longer. She was given wrong. She stays here against her will." His eyes cut to Eliza, daring her to contradict him, expecting obedience. For a moment she faltered, her breath caught in her throat. All the whispers, all the cruel glances, the shame pressed upon her, they thundered back with a single command: submit. But then she saw Grey Hawk's stillness, the way he planted himself before the snow, not to claim her but to shield her. His silence was not indifference, it was defense. Something rose in her chest, fragile yet fierce, and she stepped into the doorway. "I will not go," she said, her voice trembling yet carrying across the storm. The men shifted, startled. Amos narrowed his eyes. "Child, you don't know what you're saying. He's a savage, an old man, and you." "He has been kinder than you," Eliza cut in, her words sharp with a strength she had never heard in herself. "Kinder than my own kin who gave me away. I am not his prisoner. I am not your property. I stay where there is dignity." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she did not waver. The men muttered, unease rippling through them. Some lowered their rifles, uncertain. Amos's jaw tightened, fury flickering in his eyes at being defied by a girl barely grown. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "Think on your future. Think on the shame." Grey Hawk's deep voice broke the air then, low and resonant, the first words he had spoken in the open since this began. "Her choice is hers." His accent carried the weight of another tongue, his English heavy but undeniable. The statement landed like thunder. For once, the town heard him not as silence, not as rumor, but as man. The sheriff faltered, eyes darting between them. The storm swirled harder, snow piling at their boots, lantern flames bending in the wind. One of the men muttered, "Ain't right, Amos. She's speakin' clear." Another shifted, lowering his gun entirely. Fear was easier when she had been silent. Defiance, clothed in innocence, cracked their certainty. Eliza stepped further into the snow, cloak trailing, cheeks flushed from cold and courage. She placed her hand against Grey Hawk's arm, steadying herself, though the gesture looked to the men like a claim of her own. "You came to drag me back into your whispers," she said, her voice softer now, but each word carried. "But I am not ashamed here. Not any more." Silence fell heavy, broken only by the howl of wind. Amos looked at her, then at Grey Hawk, and something in his resolve faltered. He spat into the snow, frustration sharp. "You'll find no welcome in this town," he warned. Then he turned sharply, motioning to the men. One by one, they lowered their rifles, lantern light bobbing as they melted back into the storm. Their mutters faded into distance until only Amos remained, his glare lingering. At last, even he turned, his boots crunching into the drifts, his shadow swallowed by night. Eliza's knees weakened, relief pouring through her so sudden she nearly fell. Grey Hawk steadied her with one hand, his palm broad against her back, the touch firm but careful. The door swung shut behind them, muting the wind, enclosing them once more in firelight. For a long moment, neither spoke. The flames crackled, throwing light across the walls, painting their shadows together. Her eyes lifted to him and she whispered, "You gave me back my voice." He shook his head slowly, his gaze holding hers with a depth that made her breath hitch. "You found it yourself." The words were spare, yet in them lived a truth greater than any vow. The weight of everything pressed close then. The empty cradle, the folded shawl, the nights of silence, the sorrow she had overheard. Without thought, she stepped forward, pressing her forehead against his chest. His heart beat strong beneath her cheek, steady as the land itself. For a breath she feared he would pull away, retreat into silence again. Instead, his arm came around her, slow and careful, drawing her close. The cabin no longer felt cold. The storm outside could rage for days, but within those walls a different fire burned. Not sudden, not fierce, but steady, a flame coaxed into life after a long winter. She did not speak of love. He did not name it either. Yet in the hush of their embrace, something thawed fully at last. A bond not forged by transaction but by choice, by endurance, by quiet grace. The storm howled louder, shaking the shutters, rattling the chimney. Eliza lifted her head, her eyes bright with unshed tears, her voice barely above a breath. "They will not stop, will they?" Gray Hawk's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting toward the axe by the wall, the firelight glinting across its scarred blade. "No," he said, voice low as thunder. "But neither will we." Her heart beat harder, not with fear but with the strange, fierce comfort of belonging. She drew closer, hand gripping the fabric of his cloak, ready at last to face the storm not as a girl given away, but as a woman who had chosen where she stood. The fire cracked, the storm roared, and outside, the snow fell heavy, blanketing the land in silence. Inside, two shadows leaned into each other, unbroken, waiting for whatever the world dared to send next.